Eric,
Omar.
typically for a Hollywood blockbuster film, what is like the average runtime approximately?
Is this a Peter Jackson film?
No, this is just your average schlock that they just throw out to the masses these days to kind of entertain and distract them.
I'd say probably Peter Jackson minus enough hours to equal about 72 minutes.
Yeah, because this hour has 72 minutes. That's exactly what you're going to experience today. The most concentrated conversation regarding saturated fat, specifically, as I understand it, soon to be Dr. Flanagan, all about how to boost your testosterone levels with extremely high levels of saturated fat intake, what doctors don't want you to know.
Yeah, and unsurprisingly, we have Dr. Spencer Nadolsky on here, who doesn't
Divulging.
want us to know anything. And then very shortly, soon to be Dr. Flanagan, I think he's got his defense on June 14th. Is that what you said? 15th? 14th?
I did 14th, yeah.
Oh, that's exciting. So we're getting him before he officially starts not wanting us to know things, which is great. And yeah, so I'm just going to put forth the things that are currently known by most people about saturated fat, which are likely true because a lot of people say them, and they're not at all contradictory. And then we can just go from there and address maybe the fine details. I have a feeling I might close it out with just this initial statement because it's all pretty clear. So one, saturated fat does cause heart attacks immediately. Two, saturated fat is totally fine to have in the diet in very high amounts.
Right.
Three, you need to have a high saturated fat so that you can have high testosterone levels.
Right.
And yeah, that's pretty much it. I think we're good, right?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for joining Iron Culture. And this has been an excellent episode with soon-to-be Dr. Flanagan and Dr. Nadolsky. Anything else you guys want to cover on this topic, maybe to flesh out some of these things? Maybe we'll start with that first one. Just kind of maybe generally, like, saturated fat, good or bad?
I think it's probably a good idea to kind of go over why do they call it saturated fat as opposed to the polyunsaturated versus monounsaturated. I know Alan is a biochemist, right? He's a biochemist.
All right. Okay, fine. All right. Okay, panel, what is saturated fat? No, but in all seriousness.
Come on, Alan. I want to hear the biochemistry here. I know you know.
Yeah, so look, the distinction is a chemical composition one. You know, as far as our dietary fat, we have our total dietary fat, and then we have our three primary subcomponents of that particular macronutrient into saturated, mono, and polyunsaturated. And we could classify the latter two simply under the umbrella of unsaturated fat versus saturated fat. And that comparison, as we discuss things further, will become particularly relevant. But saturated fat really refers to its structure and composition, all available carbon atoms occupied by a corresponding hydrogen, and it creates a straight, rigid structure, essentially, whereas a monounsaturated fat will have a single double bond, mono single, and we tend to find that in both foods of animal origin and foods of plant origin, but their respective characteristics are not inseparable from the foods that provide them. So the monounsaturated fat you might get from steak is not necessarily equivalent to the monounsaturated fat you'd get from olive oil. And then we have the final class of polyunsaturated fats, and then I think people know where this is going. Poly meaning two or more double bonds in the structure of the fatty acid. So a lot more of a kind of fluid structure, so to speak. And it is the fat subtype that is home to our essential fatty acids. So they tend to be the omega-3, ALA, alpha-linoleic acid, and omega-6 linoleic acid. And then we could get into an argument about whether EPA and DHA should be considered essential. I'm probably in the camp that says they are, but I think if we're going to stay focused on saturated fat today, we don't need to go down that rabbit hole. So that's really our distinction. And then the primary food sources of saturated fat in the diet are foods of animal origin, animal fat, beef, any sort of fatty meats. And then there are some plant fat sources like coconut oil, which obviously became popular in the kind of paleo and ancestral community, despite the fact I really doubt their Paleolithic origins. But nevertheless, they're kind of part of the overall picture. But they're not historically significant contributors in the typical Western diet. If we go back to the early epidemiology when saturated fat in a lot of Western industrialized countries post-Second World War had levels of intake of 19, 20, 21%. The primary food sources contributing to that were beef, whole milk, dairy, lard, and butter. And so they're kind of the food sources that have attracted most of our interest as far as kind of saturated fat and its relationship with coronary heart disease and cardiovascular disease. But in current knowledge, and indeed if we really truly dig into the previous research throughout that early period, say the 1950s and 60s, the early post-Second World War period, you can see that food source is a relevant factor here. And so, for example, the saturated fat that we might get from fermented whole milk dairy products like yogurt and cheese does not necessarily have the same potential impact on blood cholesterol levels as the saturated fat in butter. So there's nuance within the conversation, but the primary distinction, other than its chemical structure, obviously, is the food sources contributing to it and the balance of those food sources in the typical human diet and the relationship between that balance and cardiovascular and coronary heart disease.
Well, that was a pretty long intro there. I was just going to ask about the biochemical structure.
Oh, look,
you did it. You did it. That's good. No, I think it's important to start there, because as Alan said, soon to be Dr. Flanagan, there's a lot of nuance because there's different types of saturated fatty acids and then polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fatty acids. So when people think saturated fat, they just think all saturated fat is particularly harmful, but there's degrees within there. And like you said, there's also shorter chains, medium chains, and then longer chains. And in there are differences in effects on your cholesterol, which then go back to your question of heart disease, atherosclerosis. That was the first question you brought up, right?
My first question was a nonsense joke, but carry on. You're doing great.
No, I thought that was the first. I mean, but that was.
I don't remember what I said. Spencer, come on.
and Spencer, like to that, I think what people often get bogged down in is this question over like good or bad simpliciter, rather than the fact that any nutrient in food in isolation is not necessarily harmful or health promoting, right? Independent of wider context of levels of intake or otherwise. And with saturated fat, it's never been that necessarily any given food is particularly harmful or itself. The associations are not independent of its absolute level of intake and proportion of energy intake in the diet. And of course, then within that, the relationship with other fat subtypes. So, this idea of bad in isolation doesn't hold. It's like, but there are definitely contexts of levels of intake in which it is a driver of intermediate risk factors and poses a substantial risk for cardiovascular disease over time.
So I would say that the biggest relationship with saturated fat in coronary artery disease or atherosclerosis is probably how much of a difference it increases your LDL cholesterol and ApoB, apolipoprotein B, the little particles that carry the cholesterol that can be retained in your artery wall and start the cascade of atherosclerosis. So I bring up the different foods. Alan brought up the different foods. Like chocolate, for example, has a fatty acid, a saturated fatty acid, stearic acid, which it's a saturated fatty acid, yet it has a neutral effect on LDL cholesterol, ApoB. And so, yeah, totally. I think it matters the type of food, the dietary pattern, what you're replacing it with. Obviously, that's like a big thing that Alan gets into with like the epidemiology. And so, we can go further into why some of these saturated fats seem to increase cholesterol and why that's bad. I don't know where you like to go with this. I kind of liked where Alan was going with how rigid and how fluid.
You like, if we go somewhere rigid, Spencer's a happy man.
Yeah, I like that. I like that discussion.
Well, I think a good place to start, because of the level of really misconceived criticism of the how we got here side of the story, and particularly the various low carb iterations, whether kind of just basic low carb or kind of paleo, ancestral, whatever, carnivore now, have a very distinct narrative about the origin of our recommendations to lower saturated fat for heart disease. And it's absolutely nonsensical, and it's such a distortion of the historical record. But the origin from an actual scientific perspective is, and people think it's epidemiology, and it's not. It's really robustly, tightly controlled metabolic ward studies conducted through the 1950s, and not just by Ansel Keys and his group at the University of Minnesota. There were other groups in the States. There was a group in South Africa. There was a group in the UK. And these were studies where people's every morsel of food controlled for up to 1 month, sometimes longer, and at energy balance levels. And then at energy balance levels, they were isocalorically substituting 5% of your diet from animal fat with 5% from plant fat. And then that's where it started, this basic animal plant distinction, then getting a little more refined. Okay, saturated fat swapped with unsaturated fat from mono or poly, swapped with complex carbohydrates. And these were so robust as a body of research that they've never been overturned. It's just been replicated over 70 years. And so independent of energy intake, those studies were able to establish the hierarchy of effects of diet on blood cholesterol levels and LDL cholesterol levels, or at the time what they called the beta lipoprotein subfraction. And in effect, what we have come out of that is the strongest determinant from a dietary perspective being the relationship and the ratio of polyunsaturated to saturated fat, which we could call the P to S ratio. And the reason that's the most important is because for each 1% increase in dietary saturated fat will increase blood cholesterol levels to twice the level that a 1% increase in polyunsaturated fat will reduce blood cholesterol levels. So saturated fat have twice the cholesterol raising effect as polyunsaturated fat have a cholesterol lowering effect. And so as a result, that ratio becomes really important. And what's known as the Keys equation that was born out of that added dietary cholesterol into the mix. And this is, again, a real ahistorical interpretation, is that Keys demonized dietary cholesterol. He didn't. He has multiple papers published in the late 1950s where he himself is writing in them, independent of these other factors, dietary cholesterol, and in his estimation, up to 700 milligrams a day didn't really matter. But why you needed it in the equation was because there's such a tight correlation between foods rich in saturated fat and rich in dietary cholesterol. It needed to be in the equation to give full effect to saturated fat's impact on blood cholesterol levels. And so, we come away from this body of metabolic ward studies that has only ever been confirmed and confirmed and confirmed, knowing what the primary determinants of diet on what we now know, specifically in relation to LDL and ApoB, is the causal pathway of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And that is what bears out in the other lines of research. When we replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat in epidemiology, we see the most significant reduction in risk. When we take that into controlled food-based interventions, substitution trials, we see the greatest reduction in risk. The levels of evidence stack up and are congruent. But within that level of evidence, there is this kind of nuance. We know that, replacing saturated fat from beef sources with dairy is associated with lower risk if you do that substitution modeling in epidemiology. So yes, there are nuances and there are exceptions, but the body of evidence that supports the impact of diet on blood lipids per se as the intermediate risk factor is robust. And then when we hold that kind of in the context of the association, certainly in epidemiology, we have a highly plausible, biologically plausible reason why there is this relationship. And of course, this is borne out in controlled feeding studies, intervention studies.
This is great stuff, guys. And I'm glad we're getting right into it. And I think it's pretty clear to me when you look at the complexity of this topic and the narratives that have come around in the low carb camps, how people can get this fully wrong, but still have a cohesive, defensible position, at least in their mind, that they think is built on solid evidence. Critiques of what you just proposed and not know that they're kind of repeating a story, not even kind of, that they're repeating a story that's been repeated in low carb communities for a long time that is not fully accurate. Like you brought up Ansel Keys, and for anyone who's even tangentially around the low carb community, that immediately is like a red flag to them because they've been fed the story of the manipulated 7-country study that should have been the 22-country study. And they don't even realize that that actually happened over decades. And that was the two graphs that they're often shown, that one is cherry picked from the other, are like 4 years apart. That actually all that data was published, and and the whole narrative on like where our recommendations came from, and that we went on this low carb diet as a nation, and we saw things we went on this low fat diet, as a nation, and we saw things not improve. But if you look at like the food availability data, we never were on a low fat diet as a nation, and so the conspiratorial element, which ironically, it leverages a lot of complex biochemistry that is not accurately explained, but is sufficiently confusing for someone to go, okay, you sound smart, shit, exactly. I think there's going to be plenty of Iron Cult listeners who, when you started talking about what actually dictates this biochemical structure of these fatty acids, are like, okay, cool. So Alan knows his shit. He's a biochemist, and that's understandable. Like, not everyone is going to really be able to conceive of what being, fully saturated with hydrogen ion means in terms of the structure, and then how that plays out to things, and then the distinction between that certain classes of nutrients biochemically don't necessarily play out the same way as the food types which have different forms of them in the diet. So what I'm getting at, the shit is messy, and when you have that, and you also have someone who is going, look, I know the biochemistry, or at least I appear to know the biochemistry, and the stories you've been told, maybe you should have some doubt in them. It kind of leaves the door open for this consistent kind of fringe-based narrative that we see, where you can, if we go back to our episode with Dr. Ben House, it's the door's open to get hoodwinked, and I think many people do, or at the very least, they just, even if they're skeptical, and I think this is a position I was in because I'm not a biochemist. I was just kind of generally, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, like, all right, nobody knows anything about, saturated fat, heart disease risk, cholesterol, or any of this stuff. And in fact, that is not the case. We actually do have a robust amount of data, and I think you do a great job on Sigma Nutrition Radio, and you're doing a great job right now, kind of highlighting what do we know and what how does the data stack up, and you even get people who understand the evidence hierarchy, and they will attack things based upon it being epidemiological when they're not even aware necessarily that it's not all epidemiological data, or they don't actually know what the limits of non-epidemiological data are. So there are multiple entry points here for people to sow doubt, if you will, into what is actually a pretty well-established connection between certain dietary food patterns and heart disease risk. And this isn't like, oh, people are going to get slightly less jacked. This is like, countering these claims could result in exactly. So it's a big deal. So I just want to say I appreciate you going through all that. But I think it's worth acknowledging that this is it's an easy thing for people to get lost with. Omar, I don't know if you have any thoughts. I know you definitely see probably some of these conversations in the less scientifically minded or at least deeply educated communities of just like the commenters. And I know if I was confused by this not too long ago, that there's plenty of other people who are too, because it's a confusing topic.
Look, we have 72 minutes, and this is going fire so far. I know Spencer has some things to say, and Alan. Sincerely, though, I do concur with what you said, Eric, regarding kind of the greater community, or even like, let's say the hierarchy of their needs. Like, let's say the fitness community, that even if theoretically they could be convinced, because that is the right term, convinced, it's not about taking a look at the evidence and being like, oh, okay, this makes sense. It's like how they internalize things. It's like, yeah, but right now I most care about getting jacked and getting stronger. And I heard like there's this guy, I'll just say like maybe like Paul, I honestly forget who first started espousing it in the lifting community about, like the misconceptions regarding saturated fat, and like really proliferated in the community. I'm not sure, to be honest, but I do know, Eric, I can't say authoritatively that there's a strong current, I would say like not just anti-establishment in the lifting space, but like kind of questioning some of the norms. And as soon as you hear like a guru who's like adjacent, let's say not as scientifically inclined, but has either, experience or whatever the case may be, or simply looks jacked or very strong, you start hearing them espouse some of these ideas, and then they do catch fire. So I could say absolutely the whole kind of now in 2022, it's almost a meme, but let's say like saturated fat, Alan and Spencer, misunderstood, also like super healthy for you, right? However we define that. Also specifically as it relates to lifting, because let's be honest, like the average lifter, even if they heard like it could remove, if they were given this trade-off, this is the potentially scary aspect. Let's say, Eric, that they would agree there might be a trade-off. Let's say they might agree, like atherosclerosis, like some of these factors, sure, 3 to 5 years less of a living, but like there is a clear evidence that it actually dramatically improves your testosterone, and therefore, like, let's say your lifting performance or your overall muscularity, whatever, they probably would take it. So I think that's that is the place we're coming from, Alan, that they're almost even willing to accept some of those risks in spite of them in order to get more gains. And so that's kind of interesting.
Well, when your anti-establishment gurus in the bodybuilding space are most of the time like on a gram of test and ancillary compounds,
Right.
like
Yeah.
you're open to that.
You confounders.
I was going to say that we already have evidence of that. People are trading many years of their lives just for
Yeah.
a few
Very
extra
true.
inches on
Very
their
true.
shoulders or wherever. I don't know.
Well, Spencer, so I would say that probably the biggest misconception in this conversation is that there are no intervention studies. This is the big narrative. We relied on epidemiology to make these recommendations. It's like, no. Like, we have intervention trials now. We can look at it through magnitude of achieved saturated fat reduction, and we could look at magnitude of effect relative to what replaces saturated fat. And again, that's congruent with what we learned out of those metabolic ward studies. So where your average baseline saturated fat intake is over 18%, and where your average achieved reduction is 8% or higher, that's when we see statistically and clinically significant reductions in risk of cardiovascular disease events with lowering saturated fat. Now, if you've got someone who's starting at a baseline of 12 to 15%, you kind of get a noise range outcome. And then if in the context of that reduction, you replace that saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, well, then that jumps up again, and we get this even greater magnitude of effect. And I just think we have this really strong narrative within that wider narrative that there are no intervention studies to support this, and that's categorically not the case.
I think it goes beyond that, though, because they're going to say, okay, sure, fine, your cholesterol can change with saturated fat, but then they're going to go even beyond that and say that LDL cholesterol is not causal in atherosclerosis. You and I get it. I mean, and so then it's just another rabbit hole of goalpost shifting by these gurus.
Yes.
Then they're going to say seed oils are highly oxidized. It may reduce your LDL cholesterol by taking in polyunsaturated fats, but those are the fatty acids that get oxidized and actually what cause atherosclerosis. So I don't really care that your LDL is lower. Anyway, Alan and I get in these types of debates online. I've seen them all. It's just like it's nonstop.
It's layers of denial because they have this narrative worldview. It all started with Ansel Keys. He demonized, and there was all this conspiracy that brought in our guidelines, and then we got fat and sick. And they, whoever capital T they is, don't want you to know the truth. And now we've got these truth seekers who are here to bring it to us. And so their narrative has so many layers of problems that they have to swim in rivers of denial, right? So it starts with, well, saturated fat and heart disease. Well, it can't be associated with heart disease because, corruption, blah, blah, blah. And then they've unfairly demonized LDL cholesterol, and that's not causal of atherosclerosis. And really it's this. And so it just doesn't matter what layer you break through. There's another defense there for them to put up. And so you're just banging your head against the wall and hoping that maybe there's people listening that might actually be like, oh, let me think about this a bit further. But I think on the whole, that community is getting further and further down a rabbit hole of extremity that I think it's going to be very difficult for a lot of people to come out unless they start having coronary events. And I know that, when I speak to people that are, in clinical practice, this is starting to occur. There are people presenting with LDL cholesterol of over 500 milligrams per deciliter, and they're having coronary events, but it's not something that's necessarily widespread. So yeah, we need someone big to have a coronary event. Basically, we need like Liver King or Saladino.
Liver King. That guy. But they're gonna say there was probably something else other than the saturated fat.
That's it. Yeah.
In Liver King's case, there might be.
What, Eric? What do you mean?
No, nothing. He's clearly natty.
Well, unfortunately, he may have been, Spencer, on the vaccine. He may have been vaccinated, and that's the thing.
It's the vid.
So this is actually, gents, can we back up for a second? Because what both of you said is very powerful, and that is the outright denialism that you experience when you try and kind of bridge this gap here and have the bridge of understanding. I can, to your point, Alan, I can 100% see one of the prominent people have some sort of coronary event and there be, an explanation rationalizing what actually occurred. And so it gets really scary where some of the things that you think would happen, and they still are stalwart in their position. Can we maybe just back up then for a second, both of you, and not go super deep, because I am cognizant of our time, but let's just say the layers of, okay, let's start with the claim. High saturated fat intake is actually good for you or whatnot. What would the top level be just for some of these people, some of the claims, just to overturn a few of them very briefly? You don't have to go super in depth because I think the cult's follow along with you. But I just find it interesting because as soon as you overturn another claim, I forget what the term is called, but another few pop up and it's like a game of whack-a-mole, essentially.
Whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
I mean, look, the top line is if someone's going to say a high saturated fat intake, the problem with nutrition is terms like high or low really need to be given a definition on what they mean. And this plays out in research, okay? So what we mean by high and risk, over 16% of your energy intake would start to potentially manifest in people that are, kind of more responsive to the impact on LDL. Over 18%, 20%, that risk just becomes unambiguous and clear, and in any population that has ever had levels of saturated fat that high. So that risk is there, whether someone wants to dance around that or not. But, a lot of the analyses that get thrown out, and Menno is a culprit of this kind of, within the fitness industry, throwing out studies on, high saturated fat reduces risk of stroke. You look at that study, you see that it was in a Japanese population where high was 24 grams a day. Right? The real interpretation of that study was saturated fat intake within current dietary guideline recommendations reduces risk of stroke. That's not sensationalist. So there's an interpretive issue that plays into this. But if we define what high actually means, then we see it pretty consistently at over 18% of daily energy. I wouldn't go there.
But the claim is also that it's very good for you. So what about it would be good for you? I'm always no, saturated fat is not essential. We don't need it in our diet.
We don't need it. We can
it doesn't mean that
body.
having some, a little butter here and there because it tastes good isn't going to kill you right away. Atherosclerosis takes years and years and years and years. However, we are seeing people that go very extreme or having very high levels of LDL cholesterol from this extreme type of diets. And, I'm trying to study it right now, but it's still going to take years to figure this out. But in even healthy individuals. But there's no reason to have a high saturated fat above 18%, whatever. It doesn't even matter. You shouldn't go out of your way to consume it. You don't have to completely get rid of it.
Eliminate it. Yeah.
Eliminate it. But you don't have to go out of your way to get more of it. Like butter tastes good, but there's nothing. People say butter is like nutrient dense. It has K2, all these different things. It's like, no, there's no reason. Butter is not a superfood. It tastes good. Just leave it at that. Let's just leave it at that.
And it's like taking a shot of Deca because it boosts my testosterone.
Yeah, so that's what they're going to say. It's the vegans. They want to keep you sick and weak. You got to be a man and eat some butter on put some butter on your ribeyes and start growing some muscle and getting your testosterone up. So they make the mistake because they're going to say that testosterone is made out of cholesterol. Cholesterol is the backbone for a lot of these steroidal hormones in our body, including testosterone. So they make the mistake of thinking that our serum cholesterol levels are a big source of creating sex steroids, testosterone. But every cell in our body can make cholesterol. You don't need cholesterol in your serum to go ahead and make these steroids. So you don't need saturated fat. It doesn't matter. And even if it does, there are some studies that maybe there might be small differences, but it's hard to tell because I think we had this discussion when I did my natural bodybuilding competition. Omar, I did a video with you, 2014. My testosterone's naturally around 600 nanograms per deciliter. When I did the bodybuilding competition, no matter what, when I diet hard and I get very lean, it gets around 250. And I have like a symptomatic hypogonadism. Once I get into energy balance, maintenance, isocaloric, goes right back up 500, 600-ish. It's an energy balance issue. It's basically our brains are saying, hey, if you're starving, it's probably not time to reproduce. So the signals from our brain stop signaling our testicles. So when you look at some of these things like, the lower fat diet, low saturated fat, it's really hard to tell. I think they'd have to do more metabolic ward studies, and I don't even know if those have actually been done for testosterone because nobody really cares. And even still, the clinical difference is so small that it won't make a difference compared to if you're taking whatever grams of testosterone per day. So
there is some interesting research, and this is more in the kind of the sociological aspect of eating, and the kind of psychological constructs. There is some interesting kind of recent research on like how people identify with an eating pattern or diet, and how particular foods are represented symbolically for people, and there's no doubt that red meat, butter, saturated fat, that there is this, kind of fairly strong correlation between perceptions of, masculinity in some of these foods. And I think that's probably inseparable from a lot of what we see, certainly the behaviors in a lot of these kind of diet groups that tend to venerate these foods. I think there's a lot of, I think that, like, it just becomes like a fancy sports car in a way, It's like this is their version of,
steak is your midlife crisis.
Steak is their exactly. Steak and butter is going to help them be more manly.
It goes into the kind of the eggs thing. Eggs have lots of cholesterol, so it's going to help boost your testosterone. Well, if you look at the actual metabolism of how dietary cholesterol gets into our serum, and then somehow that would have to get taken in by your testicles to then increase testosterone. The amount of dietary cholesterol is such a tiny component of our intestinal cholesterol, and even still, it barely changes our serum cholesterol, as Alan discussed before. These people are they're just looking for excuses to eat their ribeyes with butter, in which it's like, I know that might taste good, but you're not doing yourself a favor. And again, it takes years and years and years for atherosclerosis to occur. So this isn't a thing where it's like you're going to die. Like you said, you're going to have a heart attack if you eat butter. It's not like, you're talking about the rigidness. And I know I can make jokes, but like at room temperature, saturated fat is hard. And people think that if you eat some butter, that's how it kind of you digest it, and then it gets into your arteries and kind of hardens. It's not that. It's actually your liver down-regulates your ability to recycle the LDL. And so it just starts building up in your bloodstream. And then it takes years and years and years for this to happen. But it's unfortunate when it occurs. And so the other argument is if somebody goes low carb and increases their saturated fat a little bit, but they get metabolically healthier. I mean, you can start making arguments over like, well, they improved their metabolic status. They got rid of their type 2 diabetes and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, all these different things. And we could have that argument there, but on a population level, increasing LDL, all things being equal, increases your risk of cardiovascular disease and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So anyway,
that whole argument of the kind of, well, I've improved my metabolic health, I've gone low carb, my inflammation, and they point to all of that. I mean, there's a couple of layers to that conversation which are a problem. One is they can't distinguish between a causal biomarker like LDL cholesterol and systems biomarkers or reporter biomarkers that are important for the overall clinical evaluation of a risk profile, a total risk profile, but are not themselves independent causal risk factors. So you always hear from that community, don't worry about your LDL, worry about your inflammation, your triglycerides, your HDL. It's like, yeah, they're all cool, but none of them are causal. Like, none of them are independent causal risk factors. So they're important to note. And they're an important part of the clinical risk evaluation, but they're not themselves independent. And the second part of that is, I think when they focus on these other aspects of health, for example, they'll often, discuss, rates of obesity started climbing after these dietary guidelines, blah, blah, blah. But even though cardiovascular disease remains our global number one killer, the actual mortality rates have declined by about 50%, give or take, on average, from 1960, say, to now, give or take about 60. In the UK, for example, 182,000 deaths from cardiovascular disease in 1962, 80 to 85 maybe now. Okay, so big reductions. Yes, it's still a leading killer,
with an increase in the population too.
Right. And what they fail to realize is that this mortality rate preceded obesity. So they try and put the blame on population increases in adiposity, not realizing that that heart disease does not depend on, and everyone in there, especially if you're from a country like Ireland, where we have the worst genes for cardiovascular disease, and everyone's going around with an LDL of 300 by the time they're about 25 and they don't even know it. And there's always, that family that, Jesus, he heart attack at 55, but sure, wasn't he fit and didn't he do this? And, he wasn't overweight. No one sees it coming. So this idea that it's related only to fatness is completely divorced from the reality of the impact of LDL as an independent causal risk factor that will push plaque in your arteries, whether you're fat or not. Right. So, and as Spencer said, what we've got then is this temporal disconnect, because sure, if you're otherwise healthy, you might have a longer time course to when you're actually not healthy anymore. Versus someone who's a lot unhealthier at an early stage and smokes and is sedentary and has these other kind of risk factors. But the idea that there is somehow an exemption to the effects of LDL elevated because of these other things is just, it's just doing mental gymnastics to try and, create cognitive dissonance to the reality of what's coming down the line for someone that has an LDL of 300 plus for 20 years. And it is coming,
Eric, I think you boys are crushing it. I want you to know we're at the halfway point out of this. We finished Act 1. We're deep into Act 2 here of this play. Eric, I think this isn't even alarmism. What we're covering on this podcast is, Eric, I forget what episode we had, but you joked that, okay, if someone misinterprets, you said it's an interpretive issue, Alan. Let's say like a volume study as it relates to hypertrophy. It's like if they're off with their recommendations, you miss out on some gains. Like, okay, let's be clear, that is a big deal here. It's like if you misrepresent some of this data over a long time course, and I think that's the point I just wanted to highlight what you said, Alan, where you said the temporal disconnect, is that someone in the short term subjectively can feel better. Unfortunately, because social media is here and now and you're getting constant updates in a very short time course of like a month, I lost 5 pounds because guess what? Like you limited your food intake, you're in a caloric reduction while also switching because you stopped eating all the food that you loved and now you're just like on that butter bandit, time. You feel better in quotations. We can't see you 10, 15, 20 years from now where the ramifications are going to catch up. And so it'll be too late by then. And I just want to highlight, Eric, before I kick it off over to you. I think it was Spencer, because Spencer's, he's a fellow memer. He's in the space. He knows what the responses are going to be. I don't want to misconstrue this, but we've certainly seen this before. There is one of the, let's say, leading advocates of, I think it's the carnivore diet, at the very least, let's say low carb, high saturated fat intake, part of that, like good for you, testosterone, all that stuff. Anyways, I forget the exact numbers when he got his cholesterol measured, but exactly what I think Spencer said was, well, LDL doesn't even matter. But when I say it was atrociously bad, like to the point where you said, Alan, like these are the demarcations, like it's irrefutable at this point, like this is bad. given enough time, like a coronary event is going to happen. And not only was he defined, but this is the part that I think gets kind of scary, is that because it's like he's an authority figure, they dismiss it, they shift the goalpost. Then the follows, like the acolytes, are willing to accept this as the gospel. And so I think it's very important to have this topic discussed. I'm going to kick it over to you, Eric, just because of the potential ramifications are disastrous. And I think there is that current in the lifting space. I don't know, like I joked about anti-establishment, but also like trust, let's say in the like greater medical community has been eroded. Like, I don't know what has been going on, but basically oh, Spencer, oh, you're a doctor. Oh, you're a doctor of lipidology. Oh, that's cool, bro. Oh, you're part of big pharma then, aren't you? Like, why should I even listen to what you say? It's like, I don't know, because I have decades of experience. I've read all this I don't know, like versus the person on Facebook, why don't you tell me? But the potential consequences can be disastrous.
Yeah, we've gotten to a strange place that is, honestly, it's the way it was before, but it's just magnified by social media and other global events, which I think have made certain groups a little more connected that weren't otherwise, you know? It's a funny thing in the States, you have people who would identify as super left-wing and they have like crystals in their house, and then people who like live out in a home in the boonies with a shotgun in case the feds are coming, and the feds have no idea who they are. And they're on the same forum, both talking about something that they share beliefs on in terms of nutrition. So internet's a beautiful place. It's connecting all the best people. And then in the bodybuilding community, we've had an anti-establishment culture for a very long time, especially on the enhanced side, because generally you're viewed as kind of a circus freak counterculture. We've had, and I'm not making a moral statement about whether this is good or bad or anything how I feel about it, but villainization of performance-enhancing drug use. We saw the congressional hearings in the 90s, and, it's not that these aren't drugs or they're not drugs without risk, but I think there is definitely a difference between, like the crack boom and some middle-income guy who's decided that he, wants to compete in bodybuilding. One of them is probably more of a risk to society. I'll let the listener decide.
Fentanyl crisis or TRT dose.
Yeah, and TRT is probably too generous. Yeah, but I mean, so we've got a community there that has been essentially doing, armchair endocrinology on their own for 50 years now. So they're and often when they do go to doctors, they have, you say one thing that's incorrect about protein or testosterone or that lifting could cause injury, and all of a sudden they've written you off completely, even though like if you got eczema, they have no idea what to do. You probably think that doctor would be helpful, but like you don't know the thing that I've obsessively studied for 20 years that I'm mostly right about, because you're just a family doctor and I don't want you anymore. Like, get out of my face. I'm out of here. So like that's the kind of things I run into over the years in the bodybuilding community, and it's funny, like the intersection now of the perception of masculinity, which is often strong in some bodybuilding circles and food types. It's weird. Like I think it's gotten to places I didn't expect, and the carnivore diet is an especially, the example you gave as someone with atrociously high LDL levels and denial. That's an especially tough one to get through too. Because they're probably more anti-establishment than anyone else, and I don't even try, to be honest. Like if someone is like, there's so many layers to that. Like, I'm eating the carnivore diet because it's good for my testosterone. By the way, I'm also taking exogenous testosterone. So how do I even like, where do I start with that? Like, how do I know what's causing probably the testosterone you're putting in your body, but whatever. Because I mean, I'm not going to be like, well, there's these 2 recent meta-analyses by Whitaker that show not only does a low-fat diet decrease your resting testosterone, but also a low-carb, high-protein diet, which you're obviously on, because then you just be like, well, screw science. Anyway, let me get back to my scientific explanation. So I don't know where to start with those people.
I think for the low-carb community, we have had COVID confirm. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with Dr. David Robert Grimes and his work, like on conspiracy theory thinking.
Yes.
And he's fantastic. But what he explains, conspiracy theory thinking doesn't exist in a vacuum. right? The biggest predictor of a conspiracy theory thinking is having another conspiracy theory idea about something else. So they cluster together. And I think if we really look hard at the low carb movement, it's a conspiracy theory movement. Okay. We saw it kind of go quiet a little bit during COVID. And the reason is much of the big names in the movement that are the lead LDL cholesterol denialists, the heart disease revisionists, suddenly all became, shock horror, COVID skeptics, anti-vaxxers. And that was what they all went off posting about. And so
they had bigger fish to fry. Not that they fry fish.
Kind of sit back thinking about this and the levels of the kind of conspiratorial thinking that they buy into in relation to our dietary guidelines, the whole Ansel Keys thing, the LDL cholesterol stuff, and the fact that then they obviously all became predictably part of that aspect of like the whole COVID landscape. When I look at the low carb movement now, I actually just think of them as a conspiratorial movement within which there is this constellation of conspiratorial beliefs, not just related to diet, but also related to kind of obviously other aspects like COVID and vaccines and the like. So I think it helps to contextualize the people in that movement and their thinking process. And if you look at the cognitive underpinnings, and Grimes outlines this in his book, some of the cognitive correlates of conspiracy thinking. Narcissism is a major driver. So I think a lot of these people kind of get off their own ego from being this kind of person who builds this, following, from being this kind of truth seeker. And also low cognitive complexity is a big cognitive correlate. So it doesn't necessarily mean low IQ, but it means that they're not good at grasping cognitively complex issues, which kind of explains why they have to default to really simplistic narratives to explain the world and our dietary guidelines and stuff. So yeah, I just don't think they're worth engaging with anymore, if I'm honest. Like I don't think there's any point, and bring on the coronary events.
Well,
Yeah.
That's brutally harsh. I love it, but I will say that is definitely the descriptor of the leaders in the space, the most vocal proponents. But I think it's worth engaging still, and I'm glad that you guys do this and talk about it, because there's a lot of people who just get caught up in these circles who are just trying to learn about nutrition, and they've heard things tangentially. There's so many ripple effects if that central stone is a low cognitive complexity narcissist, sure, the stone's in the water, that is what it is. But I think it is a worthwhile conversation about how do we, because obviously I think many things that the traditional quote unquote evidence-based community has done when running into some of these people with misconceptions is not great. You're an idiot. Let me post you on my stories. And by the way, I don't know how many people out there have had successful processes of making people educated by calling them stupid. I haven't. Maybe I'm just doing it wrong. Maybe I need to be harsher. But that hasn't been my experience, that calling someone dumb and then publicly shaming them typically is a catalyst for belief change. So
some of these people just need to be restricted. Like you just mute them, block them, restrict. Like some of these people you just don't even want to deal with them though. Like you're not going to get through. Like it's just going to be a waste of your time. But I will say a lot of my patients, they're like, hey, I heard this. Mm-hmm. Can you explain this to me? And then I go through the lines of evidence and explain how it happens. And then they go, oh yeah, that doesn't sound like a good idea. No, it's not a good idea. I will say it's a false dichotomy too. You can do low carb Mediterranean type of approach and have low LDL cholesterol, and that's probably very healthful. So it's just they want to have their butter and eat it too type of thing.
Yes,
it sounds ridiculous, but it's basically here's where they think. I love low carb. It's the best diet out there. But sometimes if you go low carb and eat ribeyes and butter, your LDL just skyrockets. Well, if that happens and LDL and low carb's the best diet, then that means that LDL can't be bad for you. And therefore, all these other things have to be bad for you. And then they do the mental gymnastics. I mean, we see it all day. Yeah. I mean, it used to drive me nuts, but now it's kind of like It's kind of like the Matrix. I kind of watch it. I'm like, oh my God, it's just the patterns are out there, and now I don't even deal with it so much anymore. So anyway, yeah.
They
Now
must
you
eat
know
some
kung
seed
fu.
oils.
Yeah.
But Spencer, I was going to say, I do think there is a category of people that extend that proverbial, Eric, olive branch. So let's say the reformed bro or broette, because let me paint a stereotype here that was made in the flesh to me. Over a year ago, there's a Canadian chain, a grocery store called No Frills, and I was shopping. I noticed this individual stocking up on bacon. And when I say stocking up, I mean his cart was full. So of course I made the right call. I said, "Hey man," I said, "You stocking up?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "Because like the prices are skyrocketing." And he said, "The next world." I am not even exaggerating, and I should say from the outset, he didn't give off like pure conspiracy theorist vibes. Like he has like tinfoil hat, but it's more just like hard line. Like this is what I believe. He said, the next world war will be fought over bacon, like out of the blue. He said that, and he was like 100% serious. And he said, and I forget what he said. And he said, "I rather die than not be able to eat bacon." And I was like, fair enough. I said, "Have a nice day," or whatever. But like, that's the person. So Alan, what he said, like the coronary
And he
event.
proceeded to the checkout.
The irony.
And he argued about, can I pay in Bitcoin?
Right? Yeah. He said, my Luna stock has crashed. Look, we got to hold the line. No, but so that is the person, Alan. Absolutely, like, not worth engaging. Yeah. It's hard to overcome. But like Spencer, because we're in the space, man. Let's say I'll use myself as an example. Like 11 years ago, right? I'm lifting. And I'm like, oh, like, okay, like, what should I be eating? Oh, like eggs, a complete protein. To me, I was like, you know what? Simple, easy, cost effective. I was on a budget at the time. Oh, saturated fat, like who knows? Probably not as bad as they make it out to be. I'll eat the whole egg. So I'm sure there's a lot of a high portion, because it was like, from a cost standpoint, pretty damn cheap for me to eat it. Cool. I'm sure there are reformed bros and broettes over time that probably have, consumed over maybe 5 or 10 years a higher saturated fat intake than probably would be a good idea. So maybe let's first, Spencer, just start from there to the Iron Cult. Maybe if they're having, they're reforming some of their thoughts. If we look at some of the long-term effects, let's assume in this space, so like the bodybuilding community, or like actually I would say the bodybuilding community is all, like more like moderate fat or like lower fat, but let's just say the lifting community, the powerlifting boys and girls, where it's like you cook up the bacon, you get to training, like you slam it out, you train. What are some of the key things they should keep in mind in terms of some of their previous dietary habits and how it might affect them either long-term or some of their future habits they should be aware of? These people at the intersection that are willing to make a change that you can reach and you can have those conversations. If someone comes to you, Spencer, what does that look like? Let's say they're open to readjusting their diet. So let's start on the easier path, not buddy, cart full of bacon, paying in Luna, saying the world's going to end. He's gone. Like we already know he's done for. Let's talk about this base right here. Thank you for your service.
I think the biggest changes you see, as Alan kind of mentioned at the beginning, is those who are having a very high amount. So these are the people that are doing the bulletproof coffee thing. It's not as popular anymore, but people that were putting coconut oil and butter into their coffee. They were doing pork rinds, meat and cheese, lunches type of thing, dinners of the butter ribeyes. Those people usually you see a substantial, like I see it looks like they have familial hypercholesterolemia, where they're milligrams per deciliter, it's above 190. It's sometimes 200s, 300s, 400s. In these types of people, it's very easy to bring their levels down quickly. And then I usually just say area under the curve. You go to your doctor, get your lipids. You're not going to die right away if your lipids are super elevated. It takes a long time. I mean, even with people with familial hypercholesterolemia, a few decades at least to start seeing some plaque, depending on how high it is. Sometimes they do get plaque pretty early, but so area under the curve. Don't freak out. Just get your lipids. Then start making changes. The big swaps, as Alan talked about in the beginning. Okay, let's find where you're eating the saturated fat. Butter is such a big culprit, and coconut oil. So if they're adding those things to their cooking, you switch them to EVOO. Extra virgin olive oil. Now that won't have as much of effect as a polyunsaturated. So the EVOO is mostly monounsaturated. It won't be as much as say to like canola oil. But I think you could probably convince them that EVOO tastes pretty good, and there's some good outcome data that seem to suggest that may have other benefits on your heart and endothelial, your arteries, even more so than just the LDL. But just doing that little swap will probably make a big difference. Looking at what kind of carbohydrates that they eat, if they're super low carb, maybe switching some more of just fat calories, saturated fat calories, to soluble fiber. Soluble fiber can bind some of the intestinal cholesterol. That's not just from dietary cholesterol, but also just our intestinal cholesterol from bile, which that has this effect on upregulating our recycling of LDL. So two quick little things: switching your saturated fat, butter, coconut oil, added stuff, to either extra virgin olive oil, or you can do avocado oil too. I like that. And then switching some of those added fats, like from your cheese and things like that. Maybe you switch it to avocado, just avocados, or maybe you switch it to more soluble types of fibrous carbs. And those two things together, I do these lentil soup challenges like once a year, and I just say, hey, do this challenge. I don't make any money from it. I just post it on Instagram, and then I have people email me what they did, and they go, I lost a little bit of weight, but my LDL cholesterol went from the 160s down to like 100 because they replaced whatever saturated fat they're eating and whatever calories with then just pretty much lentils, which is carbohydrates, soluble fiber. So those two little things, then you can get a little bit more nuance, and you can start switching some of the animal proteins, whatever, steak. As Alan said, there are monounsaturated fats in it, but once you start replacing that with more plant-based types of foods that doesn't have as much cholesterol in it, which said doesn't have as much of an effect, but that's where you start seeing further and further improvements in your serum cholesterol. You just do some of these swaps, area under the curve, you start seeing like 20 to 30 milligram per deciliter difference, and that can make a big difference over long term. Like, I personally take a drug called ezetimibe every single day, even though my LDL is somewhere around 110 to 130s in between there, and now mine is under 100 just from this one drug. It's not going to make a difference in 1 year. It's going to make a difference, I'm hoping, over 30 years while I'm taking this medicine. And so making those dietary changes can have that same effect. It's a very similar effect to what I'm doing with the drug. So think area under the curve. Don't get freaked out if your cholesterol is really high, but just make some changes. Within a week or 2 weeks, you can reach, if you make some drastic changes, you can check your cholesterol, your lipids, your serum cholesterol, total cholesterol, LDL, and everything. Within 2 weeks, you'll see the difference. And if you need to make a few further adjustments, you may notice that it might be genetic, that you can't really change it very much with dietary differences, but a lot of people listening to this could go, you know what, my cholesterol has been high. I'm going to try some of these things. And they'll send you guys a message, go, hey, that actually worked. It went down by 20, 30. Literally within 2 weeks, you can recheck it. It happens quickly. That's the practical change that you can do.
And that's not like a huge ask, especially for the people listening to our podcast, giving them easy things to swap in when you're already, I know for me, like, I have a very boring, diet that stays very similar for at least 2 out of 3 meals of the day. And if someone was like, and just because that's kind of the nature of bodybuilding nutrition for most people, not always, it's easy to swap in and out new things. That's a vegetable that's high in soluble fiber. Sweet, I will now have lentils. Thank you, Dr. Nadolsky. You saved my life. So yeah, I think that's really actionable advice and very easy to implement. So I guess at this point, we've covered a fair amount of ground, and I want to make sure that we kind of fill in any gaps, anything that we haven't touched on at this point. Are there things that we feel haven't done justice? And there may be some, I think maybe one piece, if we want to get another layer, and I know this is a complex piece, so we don't have to go down this rabbit hole, but that shifting goalpost that we talked about earlier. Saturated fat. Okay, that's an issue. Well, no, it's not, because LDL is actually not an issue. Do we want to get into the misunderstandings or concepts around LDL, even though we were ostensibly talking about saturated fat, given its mechanism by which it can modify risk? Should we dive into LDL a bit?
I think we can. I mean, Alan and I talk about this all the time. It's basically any ApoB containing lipoprotein can get into your artery wall, retained and start the cascade of atherosclerosis. And LDL particles are the most common ApoB containing particle we have. It doesn't matter if it's large or small. These are all have atherogenic potential. What is it, 21 to 23 nanometers, you usually see these LDL particles. And people are like, well, no, if you eat coconut oil, there was somebody, this big influencer on Instagram, posted about how coconut oil is so good for you. And I was like, you got to really be careful because it can increase your LDL cholesterol, and over time that can cause atherosclerosis. This woman mansplained me that it's not mansplaining. I don't even, influencer splained. I don't even know what the term would be. She didn't know I was a lipidologist, whatever. It doesn't matter. It doesn't even matter what I am. I'm not going to play the authority card here, but she did. She influencer explained me that no, it's these LDL particles are fluffier. And so they're, and you have to really check the size, and that's really what matters. Things aren't as simple as X, Y, Z. And I was like, that's interesting. Well, anything below 70 nanometers can get retained into the artery wall, and the differences between the smallest versus the largest LDL, they only get up to like 23 or so nanometers. And then I explained how there are much bigger particles that actually still get retained. It was kind of interesting. That's a kind of a thing that people will say. We have so many lines of evidence right now that show just because it's
overwhelming.
The reason I've gotten into this, I was an LDL kind of skeptic in medical school. I had gurus. Some of these gurus were mentoring me, and they made some good cases. And this is back before we had some of these newer drugs that came out, and before Mendelian randomization. It was just coming out at the time. And Alan can kind of explain Mendelian randomization in a second, but basically, you look at some of these epidemiological trials or studies, and there's sometimes this inverse pattern. People with really low cholesterol levels seem to die earlier, and then people with kind of like slightly higher can live a little bit longer. Super high tends to increase risk, but people are like, look, see, this higher level is better than having lower level, except that people with really low levels, they didn't watch them long enough. These people are dying. They have cancer. There's other diseases. When I have a patient, their LDL cholesterol and it starts to lower over the course of the years, I'm like, hey, it's interesting. Your LDL was like kind of normal 120, and now it's like 70. What are you doing? They're like, nothing. I'm like, oh God, there's something wrong with this person. There's something wrong. They're not trying. That means they're probably going to die. And that sounds so bad. But that's what you see. And so these people bring that up and don't mention that reverse causation. It's called. It's the cancer that's making their LDL go down and that's killing them, or malnutrition. There's a bunch of other causes. But so people bring this up and can kind of convince you. And this is why it's so confusing. But we've gotten to the point where we have so many different drugs that lower LDL in a certain line, and the reduction in risk follows the same line. Doesn't matter. It doesn't even matter, these newer drugs. They all lower it, and they all lower risk. And now we have different genetic trials showing if you increase ApoB containing lipoproteins or LDL particles, it increases risk. And if you lower it over time, it lowers risk. It fits the same pattern in so many different ways that it's like, how can you ignore this? I wouldn't. So anyway, Alan can get into it a little bit more too. But
let's take a step back first, though. Because just like Spencer, you saved us at the start by actually maybe defining what saturated fat is. We've got Mendelian randomization, we've got particle size, and we've got ApoB, and then we have the cult listeners who go on. Excuse me? So let's get some terminology defined. Yeah, some terminology.
Pull it back. So Alan, if you want to go into the whatever ApoB.
Yeah, sure. So ApoB is a polypoprotein B. So all of these lipoproteins that we're discussing have a protein wrapper. So if listeners picture a golf ball and they've put some like electrical tape around the golf ball, that electrical tape wrapper holding the golf ball that contains the cholesterol and other triglycerides and otherwise is this protein ApoB. And all of the lipoproteins that are capable of penetrating the artery and to be retained within the artery wall, and then, as Spencer said, start this cascade, are wrapped in ApoB, right? They're wrapped in this protein. And this is really important because it's the ApoB when these particles get into the artery, it's the ApoB moiety that basically binds to and is bound to the arterial wall. And so this is why, whether it's a VLDL2, so if it's a very low density lipoprotein synthesized in the liver of a certain size, it also is wrapped in ApoB. And so that can be, travel into the artery and be retained. If it's LDL of different sizes, they all are wrapped in ApoB. They can all get in the artery and be retained. If it's any of these components, then they can all be retained. So that's what we mean is, and the reason this is more sensitive is because we've traditionally just measured LDL cholesterol, and that's usually sufficient for most of the population. But there are people for whom a direct measurement of just their LDL won't capture all of the atherogenic lipoproteins in their circulation. It's a phenomenon known as discordance, and it affects about 25% of the population. So a direct measure of ApoB will capture every atherogenic lipoprotein, irrespective of whether it's smaller VLDL or LDL or even chylomicron remnants, for example.
Pretty much anything that's not HDL. Pretty much anything
that's not HDL. Yeah. So that's ApoB. And then Mendelian randomization is a way of using genetics to mimic a randomized control trial. So there are multiple studies that, for obvious reasons, we can't necessarily do long term. Like, we can't take babies at birth and randomize them to like a high saturated fat versus a low saturated fat diet and follow them from infant feeding to death, So Mendelian randomization takes genes that we can use essentially as a proxy for a given exposure. And as that relates to LDL and cardiovascular disease, and indeed ApoB, all atherogenic lipoproteins, we have different genes that genetically predispose someone to high LDL, like familial hypercholesterolemia. And we also have genes that genetically predispose people to low LDL, lifelong low LDL levels from birth. So with Mendelian randomization, what you can do is you take your group with that genetic trait for low LDL, for example, and you compare them to other groups without this in a process that essentially mimics randomization. You're assuming that it's basically the randomization was the moment of conception because that's when the genes were assigned. And you're having this be the only way that you can look at someone's risk related to the fact that this gene has meant that for their whole lifespan, they have lower LDL cholesterol levels. And the reason this line of evidence became such a profound final nail in the coffin to all the other myriad lines of evidence we had for LDL is because the different genes that primarily influence this all mirror the different drugs that have been developed. So we have statins. They influence HMG-CoA reductase, right? They inhibit that enzyme, which inhibits liver synthesis of LDL. Well, there's a gene, the genetic defect in variant in HMG-CoA reductase, which will predispose you to lower LDL levels. And then we have NCP1L1, which is the gene that influences intestinal absorption, and that's the drug that Spencer's taking, ezetimibe. So the gene's doing the exact same thing as the drug, essentially, right? It's inhibiting cholesterol transport, and you lower lifelong cholesterols. And then there's the gene PCSK9, which is the target for PCSK9 inhibitors. And if that's inhibited, you have massively upregulated activity of the LDL receptor, which clears LDL cholesterol from the blood. And when you look at genetic studies for people that have any of these genes, without adjusting for anything else, what you'll tend to see is a linear relationship between how much that genetic variant predisposition lowers their cholesterol and how much lower their cardiovascular disease risk is. So if you're fortunate enough to have the PCSK9 variant, you have the lowest lifelong cholesterol levels and the lowest cardiovascular disease risk. But what Brian Ferentz, who's one of the leading researchers in this area, did in this just brilliant analysis was he took all of these genes, right? PCSK9, NCP1L1, and HMG-CoA reductase. And he standardized them per unit reduction of LDL. So he said, okay, they all have different magnitudes of lowering LDL levels naturally. What happens if I standardize them to a 10 milligram per deciliter reduction? What's the relative risk reduction per 10 milligram per deciliter lower LDL? And when he did that, they literally all synced into one line. Each variant, once you factored in a standard amount of lower LDL, showed the pretty much exact same risk reduction for cardiovascular disease. And what this conclusively showed was that this pathway, each of these is a different site, intestinal regulation, liver synthesis, and then PCSK9 influencing, again, the kind of liver, but through a different means to HMG-CoA reductase, all act through one final unifying mechanism, which is increasing LDL receptor activity, clearing cholesterol from the blood. And so the fact that they all exhibit per unit reduction the exact same magnitude of risk reduction really conclusively shows that it is this pathway. The causal pathway is the ability of the LDL receptor to clear LDL cholesterol from the blood is what is responsible for lowering cardiovascular disease risk. So Mendelian randomization has really conclusively shown that that is the causal pathway, and that independent of the mechanism, if that mechanism results in upregulation of the LDL receptor, that's when we get a reduction in risk. And that also explains why drugs that targeted HDL or cholesterol transfer, like CETP inhibitors, don't necessarily have that effect.
And we see the opposite is true as well. When you see the increase in LDL, it increases risk. And when you see that it lowers the risk. And this comes back to saturated fat, because saturated fat, some of these saturated fatty acids have an effect on the LDL recycling from the liver. So it's like, man, I wouldn't. Some people are like, nah, I don't really care. I'm metabolically healthy. I'm just going to jack my LDL up. I'm not taking that risk. I'm trying to stay away from that, and I'm taking a drug. I'm like, that's how serious I am about this.
And that is important because, the mechanism by which saturated fat raises blood and LDL cholesterol is because it downregulates the activity of the LDL receptor. And polyunsaturated fats do the opposite, and they increase and they clear. So the dietary variable we've been discussing, this really important relationship between the polyunsaturated to saturated fat ratio, acts the same way that all of these other drugs act. So it just all stacks up. I wouldn't.
Would not mess around.
I would not mess around with this.
Folks, I think you well explained that. I think that was very clear to me now. I hope it's clear to the cult. And we are actually at that 72-minute mark, almost exactly. I'm not even kidding.
Yeah.
So I just want to open the floor and say, is there anything else that you two gentlemen want to touch on before we close out this roundtable?
No, I would just say that, look, again, don't be afraid of, just don't think you can't have any little bit of butter or some fun here with some yummy types of foods. Area under the curve, total dietary patterns, think that way. Make some shifts if you have some big amounts coming into your diet, to shift it the other way, retest, talk with your doctor. That's all I would say. That's the practical takeaway here. But if you think that saturated fat's okay because LDL doesn't matter, I mean, you can think that way, but we just the lines of evidence, it's about as strong as any causal thing in medicine that I've ever seen. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's certainly the LDL evidence is the strongest and most conclusive body of evidence that exists in biomedicine. As it relates to saturated fat, that is a more complex topic because nutrition research is messy. But when we know enough about the subject to be able to reconcile what appears to be the messiness, a way clearer picture emerges that is entirely congruent with everything else we know about LDL and heart disease. So, I think, for people to dismiss this, just don't pretend you're being scientific because you've thrown a paper at someone or a PMID at someone. To reject this is to be fundamentally committed to kind of anti-science conspiratorial thinking.
Well, jury's still out. No,
Agree to disagree. Eric, I must say, the one thought I did have, Spencer, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this, that when you said, individuals that died earlier that had lower cholesterol levels, it was due to the fact that they had cancer. I couldn't help but think that was the cancer caused by them having a lower saturated fat intake potentially. So if they increased the saturated, they wouldn't have had cancer in the first place. You see how
Their testosterone would have been high. And
would have been a shield. Would have been a shield.
It would have helped them out.
Yeah.
That's the way testosterone works.
Testosterone fixes everything.
Alan's like, I don't know why I keep coming back onto this podcast. No. But sincerely, I am aware of both of your times. We greatly, greatly appreciate you doing this episode. I think this is one of the episodes, Eric, where people from the outset, they might come in with a certain perception of where we're at when it comes to the available data and the information. And I think they'll walk away with a different understanding. Unrelated, we're gonna link everyone's social media, Sigma Nutrition, Spencer Nadolsky, all that stuff in the links below for those that are interested. We do want to thank our sponsor, which is ourselves. Masculinity in Crisis. The tour is happening. We're reclaiming the Heartland in 2022. The American tour. We believe in three things. You can't listen to these coastal elites. Sure, Alan's in Chicago right now. It's close enough. Spencer's in North Carolina. Draw a line to the ocean. It's not that far. Anyways, we believe in three things, and that's freedom, butter, and biceps. So Masculinity in Crisis. Link to that will supersede the Sigma Nutrition one. Just because it's our sponsor. It's not a conflict of interest. It's just one of our interests. We thank everyone for listening to another episode of Iron Culture. You could do us a favor by leaving a rating and review. Typically people leave 5 stars. That's, what the high testosterone people do, but we'll let you make your own choice because sure, there's a thing called free will out there, and we'll see every single person every single Monday from now until the end of time.